Have you ever walked into a place you once called home and suddenly felt like a stranger? That unsettling moment when the walls seem familiar, yet the warmth you expected is nowhere to be found? Imagine being told, in the quietest way possible, that you can no longer sleep in the house that is still legally yours. That's exactly what happened to me one night, and it was a moment that changed everything without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation. It wasn't like the usual disagreements or heated arguments you might expect in a family. No shouting, no slam doors. Instead, my sister's words came out calmly, almost casually. "It would be better if you didn't stay here anymore," she said, as if this was a simple, temporary arrangement, a decision made for convenience rather than conflict. Her tone was so steady, so composed, that at first I didn't grasp the full weight of what she was saying. I thought maybe she was just tired, or maybe there was some practical reason behind it that I hadn't yet understood. After all, why would she say something so drastic without explaining why? But even as I stood there, hearing those words, something inside me shifted. It was a subtle change, like the air in the room grew heavier and the familiar space suddenly felt foreign. I glanced around, noticing the quietness that wasn't there before, the way the room seemed colder despite the warmth outside. I wanted to ask questions, to understand, but she didn't offer any answers. Instead, a kind of silence filled the space between us, a silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. Have you ever been through this before? That moment when you realize that what you thought was solid ground beneath your feet is actually shifting, pulling away without warning? It's confusing, painful, and deeply isolating. You begin to question everything. Your place, your belonging, your right to be there at all. And yet, no one tells you outright what's happening. Instead, the story unfolds in quiet, deliberate ways that leave you scrambling to piece the truth together. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This isn't a tale of dramatic family feuds or explosive fights. It's something much more subtle, much more unsettling. It's about being pushed out of a place you call home, not with anger or accusation, but with silence and absence. It's about realizing that ownership doesn't always mean belonging, and sometimes the hardest truths are the ones left unspoken. As the night wore on, I sat there trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The house around me seemed unchanged, yet everything inside it felt different. That one calm sentence had set off a chain of events I wasn't prepared for, and the quiet shift in our relationship was just beginning. What happened next wasn't immediate or explosive. It was slow, deliberate, and almost invisible. But it was real, and it was happening right under my nose. It's strange how some moments ripple quietly through our lives, unseen yet undeniable. That night, as the silence settled back in, I found myself caught between the past I thought I knew and a new reality I was only beginning to understand. It's in those in-between spaces, the pauses and the small gestures, that transformation quietly takes root. And maybe that's why it's so important to share these stories, to give voice to the subtle shifts that often go unnoticed, but shape everything that follows. If what I'm sharing here resonates with you, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. What part of this moment struck a chord? Have you ever felt that invisible change creeping in, altering your world without a single dramatic event? Sharing your experience not only helps us connect on a deeper level, but also builds this community where vulnerability isn't just accepted, it's welcomed. When you leave a comment, you're not just responding to a story, you're becoming a part of it, helping it grow and reach others who might be walking the same uncertain path. And if you find yourself drawn to these quiet explorations of human connection and change, consider hitting like. It's a small gesture that carries a big message, that these stories matter, that this space matters. Every like boosts the chance of reaching someone who might feel alone in their confusion or hope. Most importantly, if you want to keep uncovering these hidden moments alongside me, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. It's not just about following a channel. It's about joining a journey, one that's as much yours as it is mine. Your presence here keeps this conversation alive, opening doors for more stories, more insights, and more understanding. So take a moment, share what's on your heart, and let's keep this dialogue going. Because these moments, though subtle, are the ones that quietly shape who we are, and together, they become something much bigger than any of us could face alone. The house still had my name on every official document: deed, mortgage statements, utility bills. Each envelope arriving in the mail was a silent reminder that, legally, I was still tethered to this place. Yet, the physical reality inside those walls no longer matched the paper trail. Walking past the faded paint, the cracked sidewalk, and the familiar front door, now slightly warped from years of neglect, I was met with the dissonance between possession and presence. The keys I once clutched with certainty felt alien now, heavy in my palm, as if weighed down by the invisible barrier that had grown between me and the life inside. Bills were paid, insurance renewed, taxes settled, but my role had shifted into something spectral. I was a ghost landlord, an absentee tenant of my own history. This contradiction was more than bureaucratic, it was psychological. The house belonged to me on paper, but the echoes of laughter, the scent of old wood and dust, the creak of floorboards underfoot, all those intimate details, had become inaccessible. Ownership, I realized, was just a legal fiction here, a thin veil over a deeper estrangement. Walking past the windows, I caught glimpses of shadows moving within, shapes that reminded me of the people who had replaced me, those who now defined the space I once filled. There was no hostility or confrontation, just the silent acknowledgement that the house had outgrown my claim. It was a living thing, shifting and adapting without my consent or control. The walls bore new stories. The rooms whispered unfamiliar names. Yet, despite this, the address was mine. Somehow, that fact felt like a riddle with no solution, a question lingering in the air like the faint smell of smoke that sometimes drifted from the chimney on cold evenings. This state of liminality, the house is a place I legally owned but could no longer truly call mine, opened a door to a strange kind of unease. It was as if the house was a puzzle with missing pieces, fragments that no longer fit together. The tension wasn't just about exclusion, but about a fracture in identity. What does it mean to possess something you cannot inhabit? To carry responsibility without authority? This disjunction crept into my thoughts, threading through memories and present realities like a subtle, persistent hum under the surface of everyday life. The neighborhood itself seemed to reflect this ambiguity. Streets I had once known like the back of my hand now felt slightly off-kilter, as if seen through a cracked lens. Faces passed by with averted gazes or polite nods, never quite meeting my eyes. The house, once a beacon of stability, had become a landmark of transition, a silent witness to the shifting tides of belonging and exclusion. There was a rhythm to the city's murmur, an undercurrent of stories untold, and I found myself listening more closely to the creak of a loose shutter, the distant wail of sirens, the muffled conversations behind curtained windows. Each sound was a fragment of a larger narrative I was no longer part of but still somehow tied to. In this disjointed existence, the psychological weight of ownership became a kind of quiet surveillance. I was both insider and outsider, watching over a territory that no longer recognized me as its occupant. The house was a boundary, a threshold where the past and present collided, and where my role had been rewritten without my input. It was a space defined by absence and presence simultaneously, a liminal zone charged with silent tension. The contradictions embedded in this experience raised questions not easily answered. How does one navigate the space between legal claim and lived reality? Between memory and erasure? The house was no longer just a structure. It was a locus of conflict, a site where identity, control, and belonging intersected in complex patterns. I found myself drawn deeper into this maze, compelled to understand not only the physical place, but the psychological landscape it carved within me. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The shifts didn't announce themselves with fanfare or alarms. Instead, they slipped in quietly, like shadows stretching imperceptibly as daylight fades. It started with subtle changes in the rooms I was allowed to enter. What had once been a home with open doors gradually became a puzzle of permissions and restrictions. Invitations to sit in the living room were replaced by directions to wait in the study or the hallway, spaces that felt less welcoming, less inhabited. The atmosphere thickened with an unspoken tension, the kind that doesn't need words to be felt. I didn't realize then how these small adjustments were the first threads unraveling the fabric of what I thought was mine to claim. Visits became conditioned by time frames I hadn't agreed to, but found myself following anyway. There were new preferences to accommodate, arriving before dusk, leaving soon after, avoiding weekends. These weren't explicit rules laid out in contracts or conversations. They were whispered expectations, enforced by glances and the closing of doors just a little too quickly. On the surface, these modifications seemed reasonable, almost incidental, like responses to changes in schedules or moods. Yet beneath that thin veneer, they were markers of a shifting power dynamic, a slow rewriting of boundaries that once felt stable. I remember the first moment when I questioned what was happening. It was a rainy afternoon, and I had planned to stay longer than usual, hoping to uncover some forgotten corner of the house, a hidden memory. Instead, I was met with a cold, measured politeness, a request to maybe come back another day. The phrasing was soft, but the message was clear. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a territory contested not by words, but by the silent assertion of control. I left that day with a growing knot of unease forming in my chest, though I couldn't yet name its source. The psychological landscape inside the house began to mirror the physical restrictions. The rooms where I was once free to roam now felt like cages, their walls closing in with each passing visit. I noticed how my own memory started to fracture, details slipping away or warping under the pressure of unspoken rules. What was real? What was imposed? The question haunted me, like a riddle with no answer. Every time I returned, I encountered new layers of this puzzle. Some rooms locked, others off limits, conversations clipped and cautious. It wasn't just the house that changed. It was the way I was seen within it. The familiar eyes that once greeted me with recognition now held something else. Distance, calculation, a quiet suspicion. I sensed that I was being watched, not as a guest, but as a subject to be measured and evaluated. The atmosphere thickened, charged with an invisible energy that set my nerves on edge. In those moments, the house became less a refuge and more a labyrinth, where every corner concealed a question, every silence a warning. I tried to make sense of the pattern emerging around me. The shifts weren't random or isolated. They were systematic, deliberate. The rules were changing before that night, unfolding slowly like a tide pulling away the shore. And yet, I was caught in the current, unable to resist or fully understand what was happening until the moment it all came to a head. The boundary between what I owned and what had been taken from me dissolved into a haze of doubt and fragmented memories. The tension grew palpable, not just in the space, but inside me. Each visit was a test, each interaction a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The house, once a place of certainty, was now a field of shadows where trust flickered and the familiar turned strange. I realized then that control wasn't wielded with force, but with subtle shifts, closed doors, timed visits, adjusted expectations, that slowly rewrote the narrative without a single overt confrontation. It was a quiet conquest, one that wore down resistance through the steady pressure of changed conditions. Memories began to feel like fragile artifacts, vulnerable to the erasure creeping in with every alteration. The psychological landscape was as much a battleground as the physical one, shaped by silence and absence. I found myself navigating a maze where the walls moved with each step, where certainty was an illusion and the past a shifting shadow. The house was no longer a static structure. It was a living enigma, its meaning evolving with every restriction imposed. The realization settled in quietly. The rules had been changing long before the night. Everything shifted. What had seemed like minor adjustments were, in retrospect, the prelude to a deeper unraveling. The house was asserting a new order, one that I was only beginning to understand, caught between memory and erasure, belonging and exclusion. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The room I found that first night was nothing like home. Yet it wasn't unfamiliar either. It felt oddly sterile, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something unsaid to happen. I lay down on the narrow cot, the thin mattress doing little to cushion the sense of wrongness that settled over me. The air had a faint metallic edge, a subtle reminder that this was a temporary shelter, not a refuge. Outside the window, the city's shadows moved silently, indifferent to the quiet dislocation I was experiencing. I wasn't just somewhere else physically. I was somewhere else in a way that unsettled the very fibers of my identity. What gnawed at me most wasn't the place itself, but the strange tension between presence and absence. I knew, with an odd clarity, that my house still existed somewhere not far away. The rooms I had memorized, the creak in the floorboards, the faint scent of old books and wood polish. They were all still there, but I was no longer part of that world. It was like watching a familiar film through a cracked screen. I could see the scenes, the people, the rhythms, but I was excluded from the narrative, relegated to a silent observer unable to intervene. The knowledge that I technically had a home only amplified the feeling of displacement. I wasn't homeless in the traditional sense, yet the expanse between my current place and my rightful space was vast and unbridgeable. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind flickered between fragments of past conversations, half-remembered faces, and a dissonant hum of the city outside. The room's quiet was deceptive, filled with the pressure of unspoken rules and invisible boundaries. Every creak, every distant siren seemed magnified in the stillness, as if the space itself was listening. I realized how much the urban environment, its relentless pace, the undercurrents of tension threading through its streets, had shaped my sense of security. Here, even the silence felt sharp, a reminder that the city was a living, breathing puzzle with pieces that sometimes refused to fit. There was also an edge of surveillance, a feeling that I was not just displaced but watched. Not necessarily by eyes, but by some intangible awareness woven into the fabric of this place. It was as if the walls remembered me, cataloged my presence like a case file, waiting to see what I would do next. This psychological dimension of exclusion was new and unsettling. It wasn't just that I was barred from physical space. I was marked as an outsider in a system that never fully revealed its rules. The sense of being an intruder in my own story sharpened every thought, every movement. The hours stretched thin as I lay awake, the cot beneath me a fragile barrier between what was and what had become. The dissonance between the familiarity of my memories and the strangeness of my current reality created a tension that was hard to unravel. It was as though time itself had fractured, leaving me stranded in a liminal zone between past comfort and present uncertainty. I tried to trace the invisible line that had shifted beneath my feet, wondering when and how the ground had given way. Despite the weight of isolation, there was an odd clarity in that night's wakefulness. The city outside continued its restless pulse, indifferent but alive, and I was caught within that rhythm, a solitary figure moving through its shadows. The dislocation was not just spatial but existential, a quiet unraveling that forced me to confront the raw edges of identity and belonging in a world that no longer felt anchored. The streets whispered secrets I couldn't yet decode, and the night held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Right below, I'm on this journey too. When I finally stepped away from the house, it was as if a different force took hold inside those walls, a force that reshaped the space in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. At first, it was just the faintest shift, like a breeze nudging a curtain out of place. But as days stretched into weeks, the changes became more deliberate, calculated even. The rooms I once knew began to lose their familiar contours. Furniture was moved to new positions without explanation, and objects that had been carefully arranged in places of quiet ritual found themselves displaced, scattered as if by an unseen hand intent on erasing my footprint. It wasn't just about the physical rearrangements. The atmosphere inside the house thickened with an unspoken tension. I would receive photos sent to me, grainy images captured on some device left behind, showing glimpses of the altered rooms. A chair that had always faced the window now turned sharply toward the door. Bookshelves once meticulously ordered now bore gaps where my favorite volumes had vanished, replaced by different titles, foreign to the space I had inhabited. My personal belongings, those small fragments of self that anchor memory and presence, had been relocated, sometimes stashed away in closets or drawers I never used. The effect was disorienting, like watching a familiar landscape slowly dissolve into something alien. Decisions were made without my knowledge or consent. I learned that meetings had taken place, conversations held in my absence were the future of the house, and by extension, my place within it was quietly negotiated. From the outside, the changes might have seemed practical or necessary, but to me, they felt like an erasure, a systematic unraveling of the narrative I thought was still unfolding. No one ever voiced this directly, but the message was clear. My presence was no longer indispensable, and perhaps it never had been. The psychological weight of this slow displacement was something I hadn't anticipated. The house, once a container of memories and fragmented hopes, morphed into a labyrinth where I was increasingly a stranger. Each altered room held traces of decisions I hadn't made, choices imposed by others who seemed intent on rewriting the story without my input. The quiet rearrangement of my life within those walls was a kind of silent usurpation, an invisible force that chipped away at the sense of belonging I had clung to. This unseen reconfiguration was not just about space, but about control. In the absence of my presence, the rhythm of the house changed. Its pulse aligned with forces I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against the edges of my reality. The city outside continued its restless churn, indifferent to what unfolded behind the windows. But inside, a different kind of tension grew. It was a tension born not of noise or conflict, but of omission and neglect, a slow seepage of absence that left behind a hollow echo where there had once been connection. I found myself haunted by the gaps left in the wake of these changes. The missing objects, the altered layouts, the decisions made without me. They all pointed to a deeper unraveling, a fracture not just in the physical space, but in the fragile web of relationships and agreements that had once defined what the house meant. It was as if the house itself was becoming a cipher, a puzzle to be decoded, but with pieces deliberately hidden or removed. As the days passed, I became increasingly aware of how the interior shifts mirrored something beyond the walls, a shifting in allegiances, priorities, and unspoken hierarchies. The house, once a sanctuary of sorts, was turning into a battleground for unseen forces, where absence was weaponized and presence contested in silence. I could no longer trust the stability of the spaces I'd left behind, and that uncertainty bled into the edges of my own sense of self. The unsettling awareness grew that this was not just about my physical departure, but about the slow disintegration of a shared narrative, a story I was being excluded from even as it continued without me. The house became a site of quiet conflict, a stage where power moved in shadows and the familiar was steadily unmade. And in that unmaking, I felt the weight of something far larger than the rearranged furniture, a force that threatened to redefine everything I thought I knew about where I belonged and who I was within that shifting urban landscape. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The questions I asked were never met with the clarity I sought. Instead, there was a pattern, an evasiveness that settled like a fog over every conversation. When I tried to pin down what was happening, the answers came coated in vagueness, like half-remembered stories told to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. Sometimes there was outright deflection. Topics changed, eyes diverted, voices softened. Other times, reassurances were offered, but they clashed with the fractured reality I was living. It was as if the silence between words carried more weight than any explanation could. These conversations, or rather the lack thereof, dug deeper into my unease. Each question I posed seemed to vanish into a void, swallowed by an invisible force that preferred shadows to light. The space between what was said and what was left unsaid began to feel like a chasm, one I was desperately trying to cross without a bridge. There was no roadmap, no signposts, only the growing tension that tightened around me like a noose, the kind of psychological pressure that warps perception and twists the urban landscape into something unrecognizable. I recall one night, sitting in the dim glow of a street lamp outside the house, the city's hum a distant murmur beneath the sharp ache of unanswered questions. I thought about the faces I'd seen, some familiar, others fleeting, each carrying their own stories, their own silences. The way the city seemed to watch back, indifferent yet omnipresent, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. It was impossible to know where the truth ended and the carefully constructed facade began. The more I sought clarity, the more elusive it became. In the midst of this, the psychological strain started to manifest. The constant uncertainty played tricks on the mind, conjuring shadows where none might exist, filling empty spaces with imagined threats. The urban tension was not just external. It seeped inside, infecting the quiet moments with a restless energy. The lines between reality and suspicion blurred, and every silence became a question louder than any spoken word. The absence of answers became a language of its own, cryptic, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. These unanswered questions weren't just about the events themselves. They were about the motives behind the silence. Who was orchestrating this? Why was the truth being withheld? And what did it mean for the fragile sense of place I was clinging to? The lack of transparency felt less like protection and more like a trap, a psychological maze designed to ensnare rather than free. Each vague response was a brick in a wall that separated me from understanding, from connection, from the possibility of resolution. At times, I wondered if the silence was intentional, a deliberate strategy to maintain a certain equilibrium of control within the house and beyond. The urban environment around us thrummed with unseen currents. Alliances formed in whispers, decisions made behind closed doors, the kind of undercurrents that never rise to the surface but shape everything nonetheless. The refusal to answer was not just a failure of communication. It was a form of power wielded quietly but effectively. It created a psychological landscape where uncertainty reigned, and the absence of explanation became a weapon. This tension was not confined to the physical space, but extended into every interaction, every glance, every half-spoken phrase. The layers of meaning beneath the surface grew thicker, harder to penetrate. The questions I asked began to feel less like genuine inquiries and more like probes into a system designed to resist scrutiny. The silence that greeted me was suffocating, a reminder that some truths remain hidden not because they are unknowable, but because revealing them would unravel the delicate balance that had been established. As the days blurred into each other, the unresolved questions settled into a persistent background hum, a reminder that the investigation was far from over. The city around me, with its tangled streets and flickering lights, seemed to mirror the complexity of what I was trying to understand, an intricate web of mystery and tension that refused to yield its secrets easily. The psychological weight of not knowing pressed down, shaping my perception of the world and the people within it. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The realization hit me not like a sudden thunderclap, but more like the slow tightening of a noose, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, until every thread snapped into place. The fragments of conversation I'd brushed off as idle chatter, the offhand remarks that seemed inconsequential in the moment, the odd behaviors that I'd chalked up to stress or coincidence, all of it began to assemble into a meticulous design. It wasn't random. It had never been. The warning, the shift in tone when I was told I shouldn't stay, wasn't a reaction to something new. It was the culmination of something long engineered, quietly unfolding beneath the surface of everyday life. Going back through those earlier encounters, I noticed the way certain people had glanced at me, lingering just a moment too long, or quickly diverting their eyes when I looked back. The conversations, now stripped of their camouflage, were coded warnings and veiled threats. The city's shadows, once merely an atmospheric backdrop, now felt like deliberate stages where every step I took was being watched, measured, and recorded. The flickering streetlights weren't just faulty bulbs. They were markers, signals embedded in a landscape designed to unsettle and control. There was an orchestration behind the chaos, a carefully threaded tension that shaped not only my experience, but the very architecture of the urban maze around me. I remembered the meetings, those brief exchanges in crowded cafes, the sudden silences when I entered a room, the subtle shifts in tone when my name came up. At the time, I had thought these were just the normal frictions of city life, the kind of social turbulence everyone navigates. But now, each detail took on a different weight. These weren't casual interactions. They were pieces of a larger, deliberate narrative meant to isolate me, to make me question my own presence. The psychological pressure wasn't incidental. It was a tool wielded to erode my confidence and blur the line between reality and suspicion. There was no grand declaration, no overt confrontation. Instead, the plan unfolded quietly, like a whispered conspiracy that threaded itself through routine encounters and everyday moments. The city's pulse, once a comforting hum, became a slow, measured beat that synced with the mounting unease inside me. I felt the pattern in the way the crowd thinned when I approached, the way conversations hushed or shifted topic abruptly. The feeling of being on the edge wasn't paranoia. It was a response to an environment that had been sculpted to keep me off balance, to keep me from settling or finding footing. It was the kind of manipulation that doesn't announce itself. It slips in through the cracks of normalcy, hiding behind the mundane until it becomes impossible to ignore. The realization that this was intentional reframed everything. It wasn't about chance or bad luck anymore. It was about control, about a methodical effort to shape not only what I saw, but how I felt about being seen. The city, with all its noise and light and shadow, was part of the scheme, an apparatus designed to unsettle and contain, to corral me into a narrative that wasn't my own. This awareness brought no relief, no clarity, only a deeper immersion into the mystery. The threads I had begun to pull were tangled in a web that extended far beyond my immediate experience. There were questions I hadn't even thought to ask, connections I hadn't yet traced. The puzzle had grown larger and more complex, wrapped in layers of subtlety and intention that resisted easy unraveling. I found myself scanning faces more carefully, listening not just to words but to the silences between them, searching for patterns that might reveal the next move in this quiet game. The city's rhythm had changed for me, a steady undercurrent of suspicion and calculation beneath the surface of everyday life. I was no longer just a passive observer. I was a participant in something far more intricate, a story unfolding in the shadows of urban life and the recesses of the mind. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The realization settled quietly, not with a sudden burst, but like a slow, creeping fog that obscured everything around me until the outlines of the truth emerged. It wasn't a matter of a single betrayal or a clear-cut grievance. It was far more insidious, woven into the fabric of human interactions that had long ceased to be innocent. What no one dared to say aloud was that the exclusion wasn't about me, or at least not directly. It was about the fracture within themselves, a fracture too fragile to expose even to their closest allies. Fear was the unspoken architect of this divide, not the kind of fear that announces itself with alarms or frantic whispers, but a quiet, persistent dread that gripped the collective psyche. Fear of instability, of losing control over a carefully maintained order. In the city's tangled web, control was a currency more valuable than trust. And when control wavered, resentment followed like a shadow, feeding off the uncertainty. It wasn't about what I had done or failed to do. It was about maintaining a facade, the appearance of unity in a world that had grown increasingly fragmented. Resentment, however, was a more complex beast. It didn't spring from recent events, but from unresolved histories, echoes of past interactions that lingered beneath polite conversation and surface-level civility. People held grudges not because of overt actions, but because of a silent weight of unspoken words and unmet expectations. These grudges were rarely acknowledged, and if they were, it was with a casual dismissal that barely concealed their bitterness. In that way, the exclusion was a defense mechanism, a way to protect fragile egos and fragile alliances, to keep the uneasy balance from tipping into chaos. The city itself seemed to absorb this tension, its streets and alleys reflecting the cracks in human connection. At times, the urban landscape felt less like a backdrop and more like a participant, each streetlight flicker and distant siren a reminder of the vigilance required to navigate the social maze. People moved with a calculated caution, their glances brief and guarded, as if everyone carried a secret or a suspicion that could unravel everything if revealed. What struck me most was the absence of acknowledgement. No one wanted to confront the real reason, because naming it meant confronting their own vulnerabilities and complicity. It demanded a level of honesty that was far too dangerous in a world where appearances mattered more than truths. To admit the fear, the control, the resentment was to risk unraveling the delicate threads holding their social order intact. So instead, silence prevailed, and the exclusion persisted, unspoken yet palpable. In trying to place myself within this complex dynamic, I realized that my role was less about being the outsider and more about being the mirror. I reflected back the fractures they refused to see or admit. My presence highlighted the gaps in their narratives and the contradictions in their behavior. This realization didn't bring clarity or resolution, but deepened the sense of isolation, as if I were trapped between the visible world and the hidden currents beneath it. The psychological weight of this understanding was heavy, not because it was new, but because it was undeniable. It revealed how much of human interaction is governed not by logic or fairness, but by fears and unresolved emotions lurking beneath the surface. The city, with all its noise and movement, became a stage where these silent dramas played out, unseen by most, but felt keenly by those caught in the undertow. As I navigated this shifting terrain, I found myself attuned to the subtle signals, the hesitation in a greeting, the quick glance away, the unfilled invitation. Each was a thread in the tapestry of exclusion, a piece of the puzzle that no one wanted to complete. But understanding the reason behind the silence and the distance didn't ease the tension. It only underscored the complexity of human relationships tangled in webs of fear, control, and past grievances. Right below, I'm on this journey too. The house had long ceased to be merely a dwelling. It had transformed into an unspoken ledger of power, a spatial manifesto dictating who was deemed insider and who remained perpetually outside the invisible perimeter. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an authority that transcended architecture, enforcing boundaries that no sign or spoken decree ever articulated. To those who lived within its confines, every hallway, locked door, and shadowed corner was a silent adjudicator, a constant reminder that belonging was not just about blood or shared history, but about control exerted through the very layout of the home. It was in this manner that space became a weapon, wielded with precision and subtlety. The family members learned early on that proximity was a privilege, not a right. The kitchen, once a place of gathering and warmth, had morphed into a guarded arena where alliances were tacitly formed and fractures widened without a single raised voice. The living room, with its heavy curtains and dim lighting, served less as a sanctuary and more as a stage where roles were performed and invisible hierarchies were reinforced. The bedrooms, segmented and isolated, became personal fortresses, Yet even these offered no guarantee of safety from the pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion. No one had to say aloud who was welcome and who was not. The architecture spoke with a vocabulary of exclusion. A locked door here, a missing key there, a sudden rearrangement of furniture. All subtle signals communicated through the language of space. Over time, these physical barriers mirrored emotional ones, creating a labyrinthine landscape where trust was scarce and every corridor echoed with the weight of unspoken rules. The house, in its silent omnipresence, dictated the rhythm of daily life, choreographing interactions with an unyielding hand. This spatial domination extended beyond mere physicality. It seeped into the psyche of those inhabiting the rooms. The constant negotiation with space bred a heightened awareness of surveillance, as though the walls themselves were eyes watching every gesture, every whispered conversation. Paranoia, once a distant concept, became a resident presence, lurking in the corners, feeding on the uncertainty of who might be watched or excluded next. The psychological landscape was as fraught as the physical one, a mirrored maze where control and resistance played out in equal measure. Yet, in this environment, the house also functioned as a repository of memory, some vivid, others suppressed or distorted. Each room held echoes of past confrontations and alliances, moments when the balance of power shifted imperceptibly. The weight of these histories compounded the tension, layering the present with the remnants of old grievances and unspoken fears. It was less a home and more a theater of conflict, where the invisible scripts of dominance and submission were enacted daily. This dynamic also highlighted the fragility of identity within such a space. The inhabitants grappled with the tension between selfhood and imposed roles, their sense of who they were continually refracted through the prism of the house's architecture. The boundaries etched into walls and floors paralleled the boundaries drawn within their minds, blurring the line between physical enclosure and psychological confinement. In this way, the house became a symbol not only of control, but of fractured subjectivity, a place where belonging was contingent upon conformity to invisible codes. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, moments of ambiguity persisted. The house was not a monolith. Its spaces sometimes offered fleeting glimpses of escape or rebellion, cracks through which the rigid order could momentarily falter. A misplaced object, a door left ajar, a whispered defiance. All these small acts disrupted the carefully constructed equilibrium. Such incidents, though rare, hinted at the possibility that the house's authority was not absolute, that beneath the veneer of control, uncertainty still thrived. Understanding this complexity was crucial, for it revealed that the house was less a passive setting and more an active participant in the family's ongoing drama. Its presence shaped behavior as much as behavior shaped its meaning. The house was both a container and a catalyst, holding within its walls the tensions, fears, and desires that defined those who lived there. In essence, it was a living archive of control, where space was weaponized not with overt violence, but through the subtler tactics of exclusion and surveillance, rendering the intangible tangible. Right below, I'm on this journey too. There's something quietly unsettling about the slow, almost invisible way a place can stop feeling like your own. Not because the walls change, but because the space inside them shifts beneath you. Ownership, family ties, even the memories that fill every corner. They don't always protect you from feeling like a stranger in your own home. Sometimes, the weight of unspoken rules and invisible boundaries presses down so subtly that you hardly notice until you realize you've been edged out, like a guest who's overstayed without ever really belonging. Maybe you felt this too, like the home you thought was yours starts to feel like a stage where you're playing a part that doesn't quite fit. It makes you question what belonging really means and who gets to decide it. That space between belonging and exclusion is where so many stories unfold, and it's one that's rarely talked about openly. But here we are, naming it, feeling it, and maybe finding a bit of clarity in that shared recognition. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for being present in this space with me. This kind of conversation about home, control, and the delicate balance of belonging isn't always easy, but it's important. If you found something meaningful here, or if this has sparked a thought or memory, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with "I'm with you till the end." It's a small way to say we're in this together, even if our stories are different. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas, there's another video right here that dives deeper into how spaces shape who we are and how we move through the world. Click on it and come along with me a little further. Also, if this video resonated with you, a like is a simple way to acknowledge the connection we've built in this conversation. No pressure, just a quiet nod between us. At the end of the day, home is more than a place. It's a feeling we all deserve to claim, even when it feels out of reach. So, thanks for staying with me, and I hope to see you over in the next video.